This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eccentric. Our guest this episode, Paul Sexton, author of Prince, A Portrait of the Artist in Memories and Memorabilia. Prince Rogers Nelson was a musical phenomenon who constantly reinvented himself throughout his long and colorful career, changing his style and even his name to keep his artistic output fresh and funky. Eccentric and flamboyant with an impressive vocal range, Prince influenced many other musicians with his trademark mix of funk, rock, and R&B. In addition to his remarkable musical output, Prince helped other performers on their path to stardom, written songs for a variety of artists, and even directed and starred in his own movies. He produced over 35 albums, including 10 that went platinum in a career that spanned 5 decades, with 100 million records sold worldwide. Fans around the world mourned his untimely death in 2016, but continue to buy records, books, and memorabilia. Paul Sexton is a British journalist and a broadcaster who began writing for Record Mirror while still at school. He's a regular writer for the Sunday Times, Billboard, Music Week, and more. He's written and produced documentaries for the BBC, Virgin, and Emirates. His successful BBC Radio 2 documentary, Prince and Me, featured contributions from Andre Cymone, Susannah Melvoin, Beverley Knight, Suzanne Vega, and more. To hear the songs discussed in this episode, check out the show notes page. Paul, thanks for being on the podcast. It's great to have you on.
Eric, great to be with you.
So let's start with how you became a Prince fan.
Well, being of a certain age, it probably goes back pretty much to the beginning, I think, of his recording career, which in UK terms is quite interesting in itself because it may be surprising to some listeners at this stage of the game that Prince was by no means an instant hit internationally. I know that his career did take some time to really take off in the States as well, but even more so in Europe, I think. So there were a lot of us who were fans who were aware of those very early records, which you had to kind of seek out. You know, they weren't necessarily all over the radio. And I think I'm right in saying there's probably about a good dozen single releases that Prince put out in those first few years that really did nothing in the UK or internationally, with one exception, and that was the song "I Want to Be Your Lover," which was obviously a big R&B and crossover pop record in the States. That's probably pretty much where I come in, actually, if I'm being really accurate about it, because that song did get airplay in the UK. I can distinctly remember, in fact, I think I mention it in the book, that it had quite a bit of airplay on London's big radio station, Capital Radio. But it kind of just missed out on being a proper sales hit in the UK.
Was Prince on the TV at all in those days?
Not really, no. I mean, that's a good question because, we're talking about the late 70s, of course, and things were still pretty medieval in broadcasting terms in the UK then. I mean, this sounds ridiculous to think back to this era, but you're talking about a time when we only had 3 national television networks in the UK. The fourth one, Channel 4, didn't come online until the early 80s. So there was not a great deal of choice, period, really, for viewing, and certainly not in terms of access to music. We had the 2 or 3 shows which some people will know and be aware of. Top of the Pops being the big one, which was our big chart show, hugely important program, that everybody wanted to be on. We had the Old Grey Whistle Test, which is quite famous in its own right as the big album rock show of many years. But beyond that, there wasn't a great deal. So there weren't really many opportunities for somebody like Prince to get exposure. And not that anybody ever said this at the time, but I think there was kind of a dismissive attitude towards, should we say, soul music in general. You use a very broad term for it. So, yeah, the odds were kind of stacked against him at first. Plus, the other thing to bear in mind, I suppose, about those early days of Prince's records is that he was, as he would often do later on in his career, but he was recording some pretty risque stuff in those days. There weren't necessarily that many people who were likely to rush onto the radio playing a song called Soft and Wet, for example. or any of those other early tracks. But I Want to Be Your Lover is the one that I remember thinking that really should have been a much bigger hit because, it was very commercial. It was quite a good, I think, early sort of example of what Prince was doing at that time. And so in short, I think it was quite a while before you could say he went anything like mainstream in international terms.
Yeah, everybody joined the Prince ride at a certain point in their life. For me, it was mid-'80s, like most. And then when I got the best of and I heard I Want to Be Your Lover, I realized that he actually had some really good stuff before he blew up and became huge. That was, like you said, that was the beginning of that mainstream pop run that he had. He found that formula with that song.
That's right. Yeah, actually, just to refer back to that song one more time, there's a story that I have in the book, as told by Susannah Melvoin, who was his great collaborator and extremely close friend, and partner of the mid '80s. And she recalls hearing him on the radio long before she knew him, when she was listening on a radio station somewhere out of Minneapolis, I think, and she and her sister Wendy, who of course went on to be in the Revolution as part of Wendy and Lisa, heard "I Want to Be Your Lover" on local radio wherever they were, and she said, "Who is this great female singer?"
Yeah,
and he just had that kind of a voice, sort of androgynous in a way, I suppose.
Yeah, it was. And in this book, you focus more on Prince Rogers Nelson, the person. There are plenty of books out there, of course, to read about just his music, but you really set out to get fans closer, and you go back to his childhood days.
Yes, that's right. I think you're absolutely right. There are any number of people better placed than I would be to take that sort of scholarly approach. I wasn't particularly interested to do that because it has been done many times and will continue to be done. I'm sure. There are new books about Prince coming out pretty much on a monthly basis, if not more. So yes, the idea here, I hope, was to talk to some of the people who did know him, personally and professionally, from various stages of his life and career. And that does indeed go right back to school days, in particular with his very early friend, Andre Cymone, with whom he shared a room, basically, when the young Prince was suffering from the sort of breakup of his own family situation, and moved in with Andre, having met him at school, in high school, I think at the age of about 12 or so.
Yeah, late summer 1970, Minneapolis.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So this is, to talk to Andre about that was absolutely riveting because he probably was, Prince's earliest close friend, I think. Andre tells the story about meeting him at school that first day, when I think they were both already feeling less than welcome in that sort of new school situation that they were in. And they clearly bonded quite early on. Andre went over to him and said, "What's your name?" And he said, "I'm Prince." And he said, "That's messed up, man," because the only other thing that he'd ever known that was called Prince was a dog, a little Scotty dog. So they kind of bonded over that, and fairly soon afterwards were, living in the same house, and for quite some time to come. Actually, they were very close, and Andre went on to be in Prince's earliest bands, of course.
And there's some incredible photos that you have in the book. Can you talk about how you went about getting all these photos and the process of deciding which ones to use, which not to use? Because I'm guessing there are more that did make the book that you had to make some tough calls on when it came to including and leaving out.
Yeah, that's right. And, it's also something, I think it's fair to say, it's something of a copyright minefield, when you step into this territory. But the selection process, which I was very lucky to have, people at the publishing company helping to source material for this, and it's very interesting. As you get further into the book, and we go further into memorabilia, if we could use that word. I know that quite a lot of the material was sourced from auction houses. I think we have a credit to that effect towards the end, because that's kind of what's happened in terms of a lot of major artists. This is where we are now, is that a lot of their most interesting artifacts have wound up in auction houses. So it's a question of licensing the image for use in the book. But yeah, I think in terms of the early images, we just wanted some stuff that would place the reader in Minneapolis, in the sort of area that he grew up in, and that fit obviously around the narrative. And Prince had quite a unsettled childhood in general. He moved around a lot once his parents had split up, especially. He was at a lot of different addresses, and I think that was, there was a sort of feeling of displacement about him, which made that connection with Andre Cymone all the more important to him, because he hadn't really had that sort of a friendship before. So yeah, I think we just tried to make sure that the early parts of the book have a good representation of some of those places that he lived.
I love the photo, his high school yearbook. Trying to describe that look on his face. He's not looking into the camera. He's looking off. He's got that look on his face like he knows something that you don't know, and he's.
No, that's right. Yeah, I'm just looking at that now, and
I want to say it's almost like I'm going to be a big star one day. Look, but maybe that's because we know what happened with his life.
Yeah, we may be projecting that onto it, but yeah, there's certainly a look of, I'm doing this very grudgingly, and I really don't want to be here.
So funny. Yeah.
I don't know about you. I remember, we didn't have high school yearbooks, but we had, when I was at school, you were obliged to pose for the annual photo, of course. And I've seen some of the ones of myself from those days, and I look very miserable.
Yeah.
Just not happy to be there. But yeah, you can certainly look at that image of this guy with the big afro and think, he's got the great big big lapel shirt, hasn't he?
I was going to say, it looks like probably mid-70s. He was born June...
Yeah, it's sort of like a sort of a trainee member of the Jackson 5 or something.
Exactly. Yeah, he definitely has the Jackson 5 look. He was born June 7th, 1958, so that's probably around 76. Yeah,
I suppose that would be that, right? Yeah, so actually slightly after the year of the Jackson, or at least the early heyday of the Jackson 5, isn't it?
Let's talk about his dad a little bit, because he plays a big role in Prince's life early on. He was a musician, right?
That's right, and we talk quite a lot about that in the book, because his father, his blood father, was very important. From that very early point, he encouraged Prince, and there was always music in the house, which obviously is not unusual, but Prince was writing songs from really, by the time his parents were splitting up, the young Prince was already writing songs, age 7 or 8 or so, and they would in much later years go on to be quite close again, and his father actually had 1 or 2 credits on co-writes with him.
Yeah, how about that? He's 7 years old when he writes his first song.
It's nuts, isn't it? Occasionally you come across that. I've interviewed other people who did start that early, but you can sort of think about some of the even someone like Paul McCartney, I think, was writing from perhaps not quite that young, but from a very early age. And it kind of tells you something about how driven this guy was. I'm not saying that he knew he was going to do what he went on to do at that stage, but I think he certainly had an early inkling that this might be what he was going to be about in later years.
Yeah, it always fascinates me. It's almost, when you hear a lot of these musicians will say, where do you get this ability to write a song from? And a lot of them will say, I don't know, it's coming from somewhere. It's coming from somewhere upstairs, right? It's coming through me. And when you have a guy like Prince, who's just 5 years old when he decides, I want to be a musician, 7 years old, he wrote his first song. There's you start to wonder if there's just something out there, it was just in him from the start. A lot of these musicians will tell you they don't even read scales. They don't even know how to read music notes. It just comes to them. It's mind-boggling.
It is. This is a subject that crops up. I mean, you probably found the same thing, in conversations with artists. It's one of the real recurring themes among auteurs, amongst real singer-songwriters. They're all kind of endearingly mystified about this process which we call songwriting. I had this conversation with an artist friend of mine at the weekend, actually, who was saying pretty much exactly the same thing. He just, even with some early songs that he was writing as a teenager, that he, they just came to him, and that doesn't really do justice to the process. It just is visited on the person. I remember having this conversation, at the risk of name dropping, I had this conversation with John Prine many years ago, who said to me that he was just bemused sometimes by how the inspiration would strike, and almost embarrassed at the idea that he would get the credit for it. And he said it shouldn't say written by John Prine, it should say written down by John Prine, because he feels well he was almost just like transcribing something that was coming from above, from somewhere anyway.
The melodies and the hooks and the harmony and the whole thing, the whole song structure, there is some work to it after it's laid down, but it's that initial inspiration. What I found interesting after reading your book, when it came to Prince, there really were two people, and this starts from childhood. He has to head the household because his dad is out, but he also wants to go out and have some fun, and that storyline is set early on. He's meant to be the guy who's leading the way, the guy who's making the decisions. He's going to be the one that's going to call the shots, but he's also the guy that's going to go out there and have some fun when he gets out on stage. I thought that was interesting too. That all started as a kid when his father leaves the household.
That's right. And, in terms of the fun part, not just on stage, but very much off it as well. You're right. I think, there were two forces at work in his young life. We can certainly see this absolutely driven work ethic emerging quite early on, long before he was famous. And that stayed with him for the rest of his life, clearly. But the sense of fun stayed with him for the rest of his life too. And sometimes that's a little underplayed, I think, in the Prince story, is that he had a terrific sense of fun and humor. But this is somebody who was probably in a very positive sense was quite a controlling figure. He, as you say, he wanted to run the show. In those early days with Andre, when they were in the first lineups of the group together, there was probably a little bit more of a group ethic, a bit more of a band ethic about him. But when the chance came for him to go solo, I know he felt some sort of reluctance to cast one or two of the band members aside and become entirely the front man. But by that time, the die was cast, really. I think, he had emerged, he'd become himself to the extent that he was always going to be the front and center guy.
Yeah, hard to imagine Prince ever being a member of a band in the background.
No, I was thinking this earlier on, actually, that, one of the many what ifs about Prince, of course, there'll be thousands of those, is what if he'd been produced by somebody else? Because, his records, obviously, he was entirely in charge of the whole process, pretty much on everything he did. And, you can't help thinking, I wonder what would have happened if one of the big sort of producers of the day had been, even, I don't know, like a crazy idea, like a George Martin, or later on, even somebody like a Don Was or something, he would have been a very sympathetic figure to what Prince was doing.
Yeah. How would that have all played out if he worked with somebody like that?
That's right. I think it's one of those ideas that you fairly quickly dismiss, because you just can't imagine Prince ever being in a situation where he wouldn't want to be completely in control. That's certainly the way that it was in the studio.
Again, it goes back to just being blown away by his abilities from the start, because you're looking at folks like Paul McCartney and John Lennon worked with George Martin for a while, and then they spread their wings, and then they were able to do things on their own. But from the get-go, Prince is I'm the guy, I'm calling the shots. And he pretty much right from the start was writing some great music. It didn't take off right away, but he was making some good music in the early days.
Yeah, he was. And, the other remarkable thing is that we're talking about somebody who signed his solo record deal with Warner Brothers when he was 19. That's not necessarily unique, but the extremely unusual part is that he was given was able to negotiate a deal in which he would produce himself from the beginning, which is on a major record label of the late 1970s, pretty unheard of. Can't really think of any other examples of that,
Yeah.
So, I think in every other case, somebody would have been expected to serve their apprenticeship and work with a couple of people, before they really came through on their own, but not Prince.
Well, you wrote it. He's the youngest artist ever to produce an entire LP in Warner Brothers history.
Right. Yeah. And I'm not sure that's been overtaken. One of those remarkable things. And again, it goes back to this idea that he had he knew what he was doing. He knew what he wanted to sound like from well before that. In fact, I've used some material in the book from some of the early from the days when he was still giving interviews. Which obviously he didn't do much at all in later years. But you go to the sort of local press, really. The interviews that he would give for newspapers in Minneapolis and that area, and I think, you get strong sense of frustration from him, even at the age of maybe 16 or so, when he's deep into his music by that point, and he kind of can't understand why things aren't happening for him. He's just, I think he was always a guy in a hurry, to get where he knew he should be. And but when you look at it from the outside, you think, well, he did it pretty quickly. But as far as he was concerned, I think it took longer than he wanted it to.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. We're back with more of the Booked on Rock podcast. Part of what makes this story so compelling, too, is where he's from and where he remained right until he passed away, which is Minneapolis. And yeah. I just assumed when I first saw him on MTV, he just looked like a guy from California, pop star from California, and then you find out he's from Minneapolis. Yeah. And he remained there right until the end. What was it about Minneapolis, do you think, that he had such a connection with that he would stay there? Well,
it's very interesting, and as you say, it's extremely unusual that somebody would do that right the way through their career. I think, he, much as he was a controlled guy and wanted to be, number one all times, he was quite a loyal person as well. There's quite a few people that he worked with over a long period of time. He gave early starts to so many people too, and some of those were local musicians. There's a guy called Mark Brown who was, went on to play with Prince, who was, I think he was working in a restaurant, when Prince just came by one night and said, do you want to not only join the band, but go on tour, in a couple of days' time. So he gave these opportunities to local musicians. And I think he did, for all that he said many times that, there were aspects of Minneapolis that I suppose were quite claustrophobic to him, and perhaps a little over familiar. I think he liked the fact that it was, his true home. And of course, by the time he built his own studio complex there in Paisley Park, that was his own home within the hometown, if you see what I mean. He just built this empire, which was, you could call it an indulgence, but it was also just a dream work station for him, and then living quarters as well, of course.
Because of his notoriety and his fame, though, I can't imagine he had to have spent the majority of his time there on his compound there. He wasn't able to just go out and, into Minneapolis area and go to the local Stop and Shop or McDonald's. I mean, he just couldn't do that. So how much time did he spend in that area outside of his home?
Well, I think one thing that comes up repeatedly is that you would hear about him visiting local clubs, and he's a bit of a night bird as well. Anyway, of course, from a night creature from a work point of view, would frequently work right through the night and way into the following day. So I think that's probably when he when he came out the most sort of vampire-like, into emerging into the clubs of Minneapolis, and would often go and visit, go and check out artists that he liked, because he had such wide musical taste. That's the other thing.
That's what I was going to get to about his musical influences. Sly and the Family Stone was a big one, but he admired all kinds of music. What are the artists that he loved, along with Sly and the Family Stone?
It's interesting, actually. Before you get to Sly and the Family Stone, he went backwards into that, because he, as we know, later on he became friends with and then had, as a band member, Larry Graham, who, by the time Prince was aware of him, had moved on to his own band called Graham Central Station, who were a very big funk and soul band of the mid-'70s, who Prince would play, and I know this from talking to Larry and to his wife, which we mentioned in the book. Prince would go home, get home from school and play Graham Central Station records until he wore them out, until he needed new copies of them. And having done that, he then went back and investigated what Larry had been doing as a member of Sly and the Family Stone, where he famously, was really the guy that invented the slap bass style, which in itself was a great influence on Prince and on the sound of his, his funkiest music. So yes, there's all of that. There's the equally evident influence of people like, James Brown, of course, going right the way back to Little Richard. Some of these are, visual influences as well as musical ones. But the thing that is really striking about him, I think, is his just how open-minded he was to so many other kinds of, pop and rock music. This often would come out when he would do his famous, dare I say, legendary after-show parties after his already epic, paid concerts of the evening. He would, often be, found at a local club doing one of these after-show gigs, which would in itself go on for two or 3 hours. And the number of different covers that he would, just suddenly start up on those. There's everything from, Bob Dylan to, Roxy Music. I mean, really just an extremely broad range of things. One of the brief sort of asides in the book is a quote from the guys who I know from the British pop rock band Squeeze, which is probably a surprise for me to be mentioning them, and seems extremely incongruous. But they told me, Glenn Tilbrook from Squeeze told me that they were recording one time at Paisley Park, and they met Prince briefly. And he knew all about that band. And, Squeeze, funny, I mean, they're still around. They're actually on tour in the States as I speak, with Glenn Tilbrook and Chris Difford still at the helm of that band. But they had a lot of hits in the UK, were very much loved and still are much loved, band that came out of the sort of, broadly the new wave of the late 70s, still around today. And he knew about them, so that's like, how does he know about this stuff?
Yeah, that's the kind of thing I wanted to find out about. And this is great to hear you talk about it. I wondered, as a big classic rock guy, I wondered how deep he went into that genre. Did he know Zeppelin? Did he know, obviously, the Beatles? But yeah, how deep did he go with those bands? Did he?
Oh, pretty deep.
Yeah.
I think in all cases. I mean, the other one, when we talk about, the influences, of course, you have to mention Hendrix.
Yes, that's the other one. When you hear him play guitar, you just, on songs like Let's Go Crazy, you just know he had to have been listening to those records as a kid.
Absolutely, yeah. I think Jimi Hendrix was one of the really formative influences for him. And again, it's musical and visual, I think, because Hendrix was a tremendous showman with this extraordinary charisma. And not that that's something that you can invent yourself. I think it's one of those things you either have it or you don't, and Prince certainly did. So yeah, I think on the rock side, I would say definitely Zeppelin, definitely the Stones. That classic early 70s period for both of those bands, actually.
Yeah, he really was an amalgamation of all of these different influences. When you think Chuck Berry too, you see a little bit of all of those artists in what he did on stage and in his music. And I want to go back to the first song Prince wrote that he ever heard played on the radio, and that's Soft and Wet from his debut album For You from 1978. barely reached the Billboard Hot 100, number 92. Mm-hmm. But you did include a quote from Prince talking about the first time he heard the song being played on the radio.
Yeah, that's right. I think because he was so driven and so determined to get where he wanted to be, that would be an early yardstick, wouldn't it, of some making an impression would be to get a song on the radio. And I think, again, something you hear from artists all the time, it's a big deal. Even when they tell you it wasn't, you know, to hear their song on the radio for the first time, I think that's a massive thing.
But he admitted his heart dropped to his knees.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I mean, why wouldn't it? You know, wherever you were, whether you were driving or you know, walking down the street or hearing it coming out of a shop, I don't know. You know, just whatever the circumstance would be, especially if you didn't know it was coming. That's got to be the most exciting thing that's happened to you in your career so far, I would think.
I'm trying to imagine Prince driving around in a Datsun. He's driving down the street in his Datsun the first time he heard
that's right.
1970.
Probably not a Corvette yet.
Yeah, and the big break comes in January of 1980, American Bandstand. He's on there. This is where we see that timid side of Prince. After seeing it perform, you would think he would love doing interviews, but he did not look forward to interviews.
No, he didn't, and he did not shine in that particular TV appearance. As you know, one or two of his bandmates recall in the book, I think he felt like a bit of a fish out of water on that show, you know, and because it's quite early on, there isn't, as far as the media are concerned, there isn't really a backstory yet. You know, it's still quite early days. So in that sense, he hasn't become himself yet. You know, obviously in much later years.
I wonder if there was concern on the label's part that he's this shy. How's he going to go out and promote this stuff?
Yeah, I think there probably was. I mean, it's significant that there are artists who are of a similar stature to Prince. Not many, of course, but you know, you can think of artists who have continued to have a reasonably close relationship with the media over the years. I mean, usually they do withdraw at some point, you know, let's say like a Madonna or someone like that. But then you've got other artists like Elton John, say, or Rod Stewart, or the Stones even, you know, who have continued to regard it as I suppose, a necessary evil or something that they need to have as part of their working life. Prince kind of got out of it as soon as he could, really. But not that he was ever short of opinions. You know, there are many interviews with him that are just fascinating. You know, and he's not shy of giving his opinions about anything. Susannah Melvoin says that he was like that in private too. You know, very shy at first, quite soft-spoken, deep voice, surprisingly deep, resonant voice, but you know, fairly quiet, short of stature. But she said, once you got to know him and once he was comfortable with you, then he had absolutely no problem expressing himself at all.
Yeah.
In anything.
Very similar to Michael Jackson in interviews. Was he friends with Michael Jackson? Did he ever? I'm surprised he never worked with him.
Yes, that's right. I'm not aware that they were particularly close. I mean, I think he something I've noticed a lot with Prince is that he maintained communication with a lot of other artists. You know, kind of in private, without no reason why the general public would know about these things. I know he was close with George Michael, for example, you know, and was very sympathetic to George's label situation when he went through that, you know, that major dissatisfaction with the deal that he had, because of course Prince had been through exactly the same thing with Warner Brothers some time before, and it's not featured in the book actually, but I know that, you know, he did tell a journalist one time that he not only sympathized with George's situation, but that they talk, you know, that they were just in touch. And I think, you know, another example of his awareness of other artists, which we have included, is a letter that he wrote to Suzanne Vega, the singer-songwriter, when she was quite new, when she had just had her big hit with the song Luca. And we actually have the letter in question. He just wrote to her on, you know, a handwritten note, beautifully, you know, composed handwriting and style of the letter. Just really, they didn't know each other. He just wrote to her to say, I wanted to tell you that Luca is the most beautiful song I've heard in a long time, and I love that because it shows you that beyond all of the image, all of the enigma and everything else about Prince, he was a man of music, first and foremost. And if he came across something by a fellow musician that he admired, he wanted them to know about it.
Yeah, I love that story. And it shows also his ego was not so big that he couldn't share his appreciation and let another artist know, somebody he never even met, of how great they were. And he shared his music with all these artists, Sinead O'Connor and Chaka Khan.
Okay. Yes. Yes, that's right. You probably know that there's that fairly recent collection called Originals of his versions of a lot of those songs, including Nothing Compares to You, which obviously you mentioned Sinead O'Connor. And that connects back to Susannah Melvoin because she was a member of the band called The Family, who were one of the first signings to Paisley Park Records when he started the label. And they recorded the original, in my opinion, the best version of Nothing Compares to You on their only album. They only made one record. Terrific album, really worth searching out if anybody can find it.
Is that the version that they put on the best of? There was two best ofs.
On the Prince best ofs, you mean?
Yeah, I have both of them, and there's that great recording. It's a live recording of them.
Yeah,
singing.
no, that's not. No, that's different again. The one I'm talking about is on the studio album by. It's just called The Family, actually, which very underrated record. And it's remarkable to think back that Nothing Compares to You was not even a single off that album. By The Family, they had one big hit off that record. Never got to make a second album, and I got to know them later on. This is one of the lead-ins to the book. Actually, was that The Family reformed in about 2013 to make a new record. But Prince decided that he didn't want them to use that name, so they reformed under the name F Deluxe, F as in funk, I guess, and made another really good new album, which didn't, get the attention that it deserved. But I went out to Minneapolis to interview them for one of the UK national newspapers, Sunday Times, and we kind of got to know each other through that. And then when this project came up, some years later. That was great for me because I had kind of had their trust, and that's really what this whole project was about. To get to talk to some of these people who were close to Prince, you do have to win their trust first because, there is a great sort of coterie around him, great family, no pun intended, around him, and people are very protective of his memory now, and they've kind of been less than respected, by some members of the media. So you have to work through that, to get to talk to them.
Yeah, I wondered how many of these would have spoken about Prince if he were alive. Maybe out of respect for him, they wouldn't have. But now that he's gone and they are willing to speak the good word of Prince, it's okay to do so.
Yes, that's right. It's very interesting that the other great contributor to the book that we haven't mentioned yet was Susan Rogers, who was his engineer in the 80s on all the great stuff, from 83 to 87. And not just his engineer in the studio, but, his I can't think of the right word. I mean, assistant sounds far too demeaning, but, one of his closest collaborators on the road as well. She would travel with him and, be on the tours and so on.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about her and also Peggy McCreary, who was Prince's audio engineer in the early 80s, and she had some great insight into the misunderstood Prince. Yeah, the story about, if you could talk about the story about the first time she met Prince, the preconceived notion, hearing his music, that he was not somebody that she should be alone in the studio with. The secretary made a call and said, you should not be alone with this guy. And then,
no, that's right. I mean, I think by that time his reputation probably had preceded him. You have to imagine that by that stage, anybody coming into that fairly closed world would be somewhat daunted by it because, his standard, he was just so exacting that it would be easy to. I think everybody would be terrified of putting a foot wrong, on a first meeting with him. And he was not the sort of person to issue fulsome praise. It's just one of those. It's what he didn't say. It's almost a situation where if you get asked back, then clearly you're doing something right. Susan definitely found that. That she just became part of this small team of people. She's wary of overstating that. I've spoken to Susan on many occasions, and she's terrific because she has such a strong sense of perspective about what he was really like. She knows he had feet of clay like anybody else. She thinks that it's, as you say, especially now, it's sort of her responsibility. Susannah says the same, to make sure that future generations know who this guy was, and all the amazing work that he did. But to realize that he was human, like the rest of us.
And although he had an affinity for women, he was very polite. He was extremely quiet.
That's right. Yeah, and sometimes you listen to some of those lyrics on the albums. I mean, I've just been listening to the Quotes new album. I don't know whether you've heard that yet. Welcome to America, which is the one that's just been released.
No, I want to definitely give it a listen.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating actually, and it really holds together well. And the great thing about this as a newly available album is that it's not been put. Pulled together from different sources. It actually was intended to be a full album release in 2010. And then in his often enigmatic way, he just pulled it. He decided not to release it. So here it is 11 years later. And it's a very interesting body of work, but there's one track in particular which has lyrics that are probably not going to be on the radio anytime soon.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of that. And you think, as often happens, I'm sure that that he would be more bold in song than he might have been in life.
Yeah, and he did create some controversy, just as the song says. He wrote the song called Controversy. Yep. It benefited him, got him the attention, got him some press.
I think it's one of those things that it works if you use it sparingly, doesn't it? I think if you set out to shock, that's probably the wrong approach. I think there's nothing wrong with having a lyric that makes people sit up and take notice, or even maybe even jump out of their skin once in a while. But
in the videos too, got some of the more conservative folks up in arms, and
exactly.
I don't think he minded that at all.
Not at all. No, and this is somebody who just was magnetic in every sense, I'm sure to both sexes, and to from a musical point of view and a kind of physical one as well. One of those things you can't really define, isn't it? You can't say why somebody has that presence, but the number of people that said, when he walked into a room, you kind of knew he was there before you'd even turn around. An indefinable thing. And
it made up for his inability to do interviews or being uncomfortable in interviews. He made up for it with all the press that he would get through the controversy and getting the attention that way.
That side of his career is interesting. One of the people, a good friend of mine, who I quoted at some length in the book, is a very well-known UK publicist called Alan Edwards, one of our best known and most respected publicists, and who became Prince's UK PR press person later on. And so he got to see him at very close quarters, and to see how he would very cleverly use the media. And by this time, he's already kind of withdrawn from interviews, so he's aware of the fact that he needs to maintain a profile and a presence, and he knew how to do that. And he would encourage Alan and his team to let's say create certain stories that would keep him in the public eye at various stages of his career, and not least when he came over to do the 21 nights that he did famously at the O2 Arena in London. where of course he was living in London at that time, as you have to. He was resident here for a good few months at that time. So the tabloid press, really, this was a dream come true for them because he's at the height of his fame, and he's in town. Now they know they can't get to him themselves, but Alan and his PR team were able to feed them pretty much a constant flow of material about him. So even though this is somebody who had long since decided not to really converse with the media firsthand, he certainly knew how to use it to his advantage.
Yeah, he was smart. He knew what was up. You think about the 80s, there was nobody bigger than Prince, Madonna, and Michael Jackson. I mean, Springsteen for a period there with the Born in the USA album, but those three were the biggest, at least here in America, and I know in the UK, they were. He was there
but by then we had caught up. After that slow start that we talked about, we by the mid '80s it was Prince mania. Really, I think probably everywhere.
Let's get to Susan Rogers. You mentioned her, and she had some great stories about Prince's peak period, 1984's Purple Rain. That is right in that period where he's in his creative peak, runs right through probably early 80s, right through the end of the decade. He is super hot, on a roll, biggest singles and albums on the charts. But he had a great sense of humor during that time. And a lot of pressure on him, but he had that great sense of joy and optimism, and she loved his laugh. And there was a great story about a penguin, a stuffed penguin.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I actually called that chapter Prince and the Penguin, and people are probably thinking, what on earth is going on here? She told this story very skillfully herself. It's almost like it's a long story, but to cut to the highlights of it. When they were on that tour and in the bus, and he would be on the bus with them a lot of the time, a fan had given them this giant stuffed penguin, which they sort of adopted it, took it on the road with them, and they would develop this kind of running gag, which actually is quite a relevant thing to his whole persona, because it actually tells you something about his work ethic and the fact that he had this determination that he would be the last one to drop, the last one to, when everybody else had fallen asleep, from just exhaustion of his incredible demanding workload and so on, that he would be the last man standing. Susan found that she could almost match him for stamina. So what they would do is that every time one of the members of the road crew or the band would fall asleep on the bus, they would take a Polaroid photograph of them with this penguin next to them, just as a kind of proof, like, we got you, and it got down over a very long period. It finally got down to, by a process of elimination, there were two people left, and that was Susan and Prince. And it became almost like a kind of running joke and just a contest between the two of them to see who could stay awake the longest. And at one point, as she says, she was sitting close by him and she saw that he actually did close his eyes. So she tells the story far better than I'm telling it now, but she actually creeps up towards him with the penguin, puts it in place, gets ready with the Polaroid, and she's literally just about to click the shutter, and he opens his eyes and says, "What do you think you're going to do with that?"
Oh, man.
I was so close. She nearly got him. But that's a good example of his playful humor,
Yeah, and it's a great story to hear, especially during that time. Again, the pressure that was on him to be on the road all the time and get right off the road into the studio, and yet he was still having fun. Again, going back to his childhood days, he's serious. He's working hard. He's in charge. He's got a lot of people that he's responsible for, but he still wants to have his fun. He's like a little kid at times.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I mean, there are other references to that. That his humor. I think Susan says at one point actually that his humor could be quite, the teenage boy humor.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like it because it's not one of the things you necessarily associate with Prince first and foremost.
Yeah. You didn't get that image of him being super quiet or even not even being in the same vehicle as the rest of the band. He's in his own jet, or he's in his own separate bus or whatever. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, Susan. There's another thing. She was very gracious enough to write the foreword for the book for me, which is lovely and poignant, actually, because she starts it, very brief introduction, but she sets the scene for the whole thing, really, by talking about the fact that a couple of nights after Prince died, she and a whole load of the people that knew him best gathered together at, I think it was the Lowe's Hotel in Minneapolis, just to kind of remember him, really, and talk. This wasn't it was a private thing. I don't think there was any members of the public there. Just people that knew him getting together, probably to raise a glass, I should think, to his memory, and to each, I think probably in turn, they kind of went around the room, just sharing stories about him, and that's very sweet, and there's some lovely stuff in there. And again, his humor comes out in that. I think Susan mentions that Susannah Melvoin told a story about one time where they went on a snorkeling holiday in the Mediterranean, and he made her he was just messing about in the water with her, and he made her laugh so hard that she actually thought she was going to drown at one point. So it's just that playfulness about it. I always think it's there. My image, I don't know about you, when I think about him, I his face comes into my mind. I often think of the picture of him, just with the suggestion of a playful smile and a glint. There's a glint in his eye always, and a little beginning of a smile playing about his lips. I think.
Well, that's that high school photo.
Yes,
yeah, that's that sly, devilish look on his face.
That's right. Yeah. It's
like he's ready to get into some trouble.
It's yes. I mean, that photo. It's almost like "Go on, try me," isn't it? It has that kind of
yeah. But Susan Rogers talking about his work ethic, she had to be available all the time because he was working all the time. What was Prince like in the studio working with other musicians and people behind the boards, engineers, producers? Was he calling the shots all the time across the board, or was he open to suggestions?
I would say it's the first of those two.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the time he would be, physically in the studio on his own. The number of times you heard about all night sessions. Sometimes Susannah talks about getting the call, Susan as well, getting the call in the small hours of the morning. In Susan's case, she'd been out on a date, I think, and she came back home and got the call at, I don't know, 1 a.m. or something, and was required to go to the studio, and was still there, the following afternoon, I think. In Susanna's case, I think she was, even later. It's probably, literally the middle of the night. The phone rings. It's Prince, and he says, "What are you doing?" And she says, "Sleeping." And he says, "Well, I'm cutting as in recording, of course." And he didn't even say, "You have to be here." That was just, it was unspoken. She just knew he had to get up, get dressed, and go to the studio. So that's somebody who was unbelievably demanding, and I think I don't have the impression of somebody that really would take that much guidance from Susan or any of them. He absolutely knew what he was doing and wanted to do. There's another story later on about another musician who was with him early one evening, I think, and came back the following morning, by which time Prince had cut an entire album's worth of vocal performances. It's just unbelievable creativity. And
an anomaly. He's not, there's nobody that has been like him before, and there never will be. The talent that he had to be able to talk about a voice, the songwriting, the ability to play the instruments, the ability to perform at a level like nobody else, and yet not resting on those, working constantly, the work ethic. And even past, you get past the 90s into the 2000s, so prolific. It was almost every 6 months, new Prince album out. It's like, what? And it wasn't stuff that was from the past. It was new songs.
Yeah. And so what we have now, of course, is a situation where, I mean, nobody knows the exact number, but I think it's fair to say there are probably thousands of Prince songs in that famous archive, and we are getting to hear some of them now. Like the Welcome to America album that I mentioned. I think that'll probably go on for the rest of our lives. I can imagine there'll still be unreleased material coming out for probably decades to come. But, you could argue that in his later years there was something of a triumph of quantity over quality to some extent. I think there was a point where he did begin to wear a little thin, but simply for that reason that you mentioned. These records are coming out so thick and fast that I'm not sure that was really to his benefit.
Okay, that's where I wanted to go on this, Paul, because I'm a fan of Prince, but I'm not going to pretend to be the fan who can name every song on every album and know when it was recorded. So what I do remember in the 2000s, as we got into the 2000s, even the mid 90s, the hits weren't there as often. And a lot of his music was often overlooked, ignored, and then it was on to the next album. And I just didn't know if it was because the songs weren't as good, or it just the nature of the beast and the business is ready to move on to someone else, someone younger. I never knew. I mean, I tried to listen to his stuff during that time, and I could never feel that magic, that connection. But you could speak more to that.
Well, I think I would have to agree with you, Eric. That there was something of a feeling of over familiarity for a while. I think it had come, it was coming back around, as happens in any long career. I mean, if you look at any of the people we touched on briefly, they all have periods where they made records that people didn't really identify with, and often they come back around into favor. In later years, I don't think he ever reached the heights on these later records that he had done so consistently in the 80s and 90s. But he's just a restless spirit. I think you can't blame somebody for being as creative as he was. And he's not alone in that. I can think of other artists who have said to me before, if I had my own way, I would put out a record every 6 months. But once they get into a major label deal, especially, it all gets paid out much more slowly. You have to market it across a long period of time. They have to go on tour,
Well, it's very possible, too, that, and maybe he did say something along the lines of where I'm going with this, that even though they weren't as commercially successful, he may have had more fun making those albums. He had his hits. He had those hits stored away, banked, and he can go out there and play arenas if he wanted to, because he had plenty of hits. So let's have some fun. I mean, he was coming out with albums, 2-3 albums a year. I'm looking here. Right. I mean, he's got 3 that came out in 2004. Yep. He had 2 that came out in 2003, 2 that came out in 1999.
Yeah, and later on too, there's a couple as late as 2015. Remember there was a couple that came out close together. I mean, a lot of the time, these were not just. I think for all of his obsession with control, he was a very generous person as well in the studio, and a lot of his records do highlight other great talents. I mean, that goes right the way back through all of the bands. Whether it's Revolution or New Power Generation, and also the sort of artists that he signed to Paisley Park, some of whom were heroes and people that he knew and had admired from before he was famous. Some of those later albums certainly feature other people, and even this new one, the brackets inverted commas new album, Welcome to America. There are people, other artists kind of showcased on there. So I think you're right. It's no real need to add. No need for another Purple Rain or Kiss or something. You can just stretch out a bit.
Was that work ethic? Did that lead to his addiction? It was painkillers. Like he had to get out there. I know Tom Petty was the same story with Tom Petty. Yes. His hip was killing him, and I think his wife or girlfriend was saying, "Get off the road for a year, get better, and then no, I got to go out there. The fans are waiting for me."
Yeah.
Is that what happened with him?
I think so, broadly speaking, yeah. And I'm not going to pretend that I know the ins and outs of all the medical reports and so on. But yes, I think in the broadest of terms, it's just a desperately sad ending to the story, because it connects back to the very thing that made him great in the first place, which was, apart from this incredible innate talent, it was this work ethic, and that in turn created this, I think, the obligation that he felt to entertain. And, we're talking about somebody who often would be on stage for 6 hours in a 24-hour period, maybe even more than that, because he'd be doing a show of at least 2.5 hours. Then he comes off and, they pitch up at a club somewhere and do one of these famous after shows for probably another 2.5 hours. Quite often he'd actually done a very long sound check for the gig in the afternoon or whenever that was as well. And he was kind of on all the time for those, and as we know, of course, this is somebody who was such an amazing showman that he'd be, dancing and jumping around all over the place wearing, and a fairly short man wearing high heels all the time. And yeah, it basically took a terrible physical toll on his body and especially on his hips, which is where the Painkillers came in. And, I just find that desperately sad that you're not talking about a traditional rock and roll drug death by any means.
No. 57 years old, and he was a 57-year-old who looked like he was 27. He was so youthful, and he looked to be in great shape. And
I know, yeah, I do. I have to mention the cover of the book in that context, because I think I'm really happy with the photo that we chose for that. It is a photo of him from later years, quite short hair, but he just looks so cool.
Beautiful shot.
Yeah, in that picture. I also like the fact that we avoided any use of purple on the cover. Right.
Yeah, you got the gold. Yeah, that's
we've got some paisley in the back there, but none of the purple cliche.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this.
Hello, everybody. This is Russell Rising, contributor to and editor of Beggar's Banquet and the Rolling Stones' Rock and Roll Revolution. They call my name Disturbance. And you're listening to the Booked on Rock podcast with Eric Senich.
We're back with more of the Booked on Rock podcast. I want to ask you about the rock and roll side of Prince, because at least here in the U.S., it was overlooked for most of his career. He was strictly looked at as a pop star, never really entered the discussion when it came to rock and roll, wasn't played on rock and roll stations that I listened to growing up. But when he passed away, I started hearing it from people. Wow, this guy was really good on the guitar. He could play. And I think a lot of that had to do with when he passed. A lot of the articles I read, they would include that clip of him playing the solo on While My Guitar Gently Weeps during the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame performance. And that seemed to wake up a lot of people. Like, this guy, he could rock. Yeah. He could really rock. I mean, he could have made an out-and-out rock and roll album. A lot of the songs, Let's Go Crazy, Purple Rain, those solos are brilliant. And I think if you look at the mix or listen to the mix of those songs, if he were to lift that guitar up in the mix, it's an out-and-out rock and roll album.
I agree. Yeah. And
was it like that in the UK? Was he ever viewed as a rock musician, or was it just strictly pop there?
Not out and out. I mean, obviously our sort of network of radio and TV, as I mentioned earlier, it was way limited in those days. But he would pretty much get played on pop and what passed for R&B radio in those days. You wouldn't really hear him play on a rock station. But I completely agree. I mean, if you listen to the intro of When Doves Cry, I mean, it's a brilliant piece of playing. It's also very bold, to start a track with a rock guitar solo like that, in the mid '80s, quite outrageous. I think I've thought about this quite a lot. Why he wasn't fully appreciated as a musician. That sounds a strange thing to say, but we're so familiar with the idea of Prince, the showman, and the frontman, and the entertainer, and the dancer. I think it detracts a little bit from the fact that he was a brilliant guitarist, an amazing multi-instrumentalist who would often, with his bands, he would really get so frustrated with their inability to do things that he would kind of go over and do it himself. He could play almost anything.
I can't remember what year that was, but that was with, by the way, the late great Tom Petty, right? He was up on stage, and I can't remember what year that was, but if Prince had lived, maybe that performance, maybe we would have seen or heard a straight out rock and roll album with Prince.
I think that would have been great because, he was influenced in the first place by artists who were able to combine some of those disciplines. Sly and the Family Stone is a great example. They're remembered as a funk band, but they're a rock band too, really. You think of just the combination of sounds in that group, and you go back through all of those other influences that we were talking about. Even to someone like it's a similar thing with someone like James Brown. I think he, again, when you think about him, you remember those just incredible dance moves, and whether it's on the Ed Sullivan or the Tammy Show or any of those performances, that's what you think of first with him. But it kind of obscures the fact that he was a brilliant vocalist. A real vocal technician.
Yeah,
I think.
Without
and that's
a
another
doubt.
thing about him. Even just as an out and out singer, his vocal control is absolutely superb and very versatile too.
Razor sharp vocals, very
Good.
I always think of Freddie Mercury was like that, razor sharp, super clear.
Yeah.
Power.
And able to, yes, and quite varied if you think about it. Quite easily able to go into that falsetto, on something like a Kiss.
And go low like Pink Cashmere.
Yep. Or Get Off or something like that,
Yeah. I don't want to keep you too long because you're in the UK, I'm here in the US, so it's late where you are. So I'll run through a few more questions here, but I can't go without just asking about the name change in the 90s. Do you support that decision that he made? Was it a good move, bad move? He did that for creative freedom, right?
Yeah, he did. It's easy to knock it. I remember it at the time getting quite a lot of criticism and almost derision in the media, and this idea that he was suddenly going to be known as I don't know about in the States, but it became known as a squiggle over here, basically, because we never knew how to symbol, yeah. But I suppose, again, as with so many things, with the benefit of hindsight, you can see that he was actually way ahead of the game, as often. He was. It was a brave move because it was to his own potential detriment. At a time when nobody else was really questioning the autonomy of major labels. We hadn't really heard about this idea of artistic enslavement in quite those terms. So I think it was quite bold. The other thing you have to say is that perhaps it was a little undermined by the fact that it wasn't too many more years after that before he did another deal with a major label, albeit under very different terms. But this whole business side of Prince's career is so fascinating because he was first, to do so many things in that sense that we've just discussed, but also, this revolutionary idea, again, extremely controversial, to give away his music, and in the UK, he did that via, free CDs in national newspapers.
I remember that. Yeah. Wasn't it when, if you bought a ticket to his concert, he'd give you a free CD? Yeah, that was right. Yeah. He was one of the first, if not the first, to do it.
Yes, he was. I think he probably was the first. And, double-edged sword, I suppose, double-edged argument, because it's around the time, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. He knew that people need, people's ways of consuming music were changing. And again, I think you could say he was one of the first to realize that the true commodity in musical terms was going to be the live performance. And that was so much his forte. That was his playground, really, the stage. You have somebody who was able to benefit from that and to market it in the right way. So yes, you get the album if you come to the show or whatever else the deal was, and that hadn't been done.
Streaming services, I'm curious as to what he would have thought of it now. I look for him. One of my favorite songs from him is Most Beautiful Girl in the World, and I don't think it's on streaming services.
No, you might be right. I mean, it's only relatively recent years that any of this stuff's been on streaming services, isn't it?
Right.
It's a
right.
I think they held out for a very long time, as one or two other artists have. Not many now, but I don't think he would have been too crazy about it if I'm honest.
Yeah, and I wonder in retrospect how much of that name change was it all about him, or was he thinking of other artists, knowing how much he respected other artists, like he did with Suzanne Vega out of nowhere, sending her a letter saying, I love your song, or writing songs for others. Was that something he was seeing the future on for his fellow artists?
I think so. I think he would have thought that he was opening a door, for others to walk through. And that example of what he said to George Michael is maybe an example of that. He certainly identified with a fellow superstar, who was going through a similar period of extreme dissatisfaction with their kind of record company setup,
Yeah, I know Def Leppard. I'm just trying to look quickly here for a little more detail. But I remember Def Leppard re-recorded their hits. So
yes.
I think that was that was a publishing thing.
That's right. Yeah. There's other artists. Funny enough, Squeeze, who we mentioned much earlier on, they did the same thing because they wanted to get the sync rights, to their songs, but the originals are all owned by their, the former label. So it's something it's happened more and more. I think, he certainly was one of the first artists to be aware of the full 360, in terms of the record industry, which far more artists are now.
Yeah.
If he'd started now, would he ever have signed with a major label? I don't know. Maybe not.
I admit I was one of those rolling my eyes when he had the slave written on his face. Oh, geez. But now looking back, in fairness to him, there's a lot about that business we don't know from the inside. There's a lot of folks who are cutthroat, and as much money as Prince was making, there were those making more money off of his work.
Absolutely. Yes.
And yes, he had plenty of money. He had enough to live 100 lifetimes, but sometimes that's not the point. The point is, there's a lot that's going on in that behind closed doors in those record label.
Yes, that's right. And this is somebody who, battles, as we said, had creative control since he was 19. So, you go forward another, what was that by then? It's better part of 15 years, 12 years or something. The business had changed a lot, and there were plenty of people making money off his back, and I mean, I remember another story in the book is about a time before things turned sour with Warner's, where he did turn up, or was at least in the building when they were about to do a playback of one of his albums, but he never actually showed up in the room to meet any of the executives. I think he kind of did it as a bit of a wind up, just to sort of say, I'm not going to play your game. Even though I know my records are very important to you, I don't have to do that, guys.
Just a few more. What about his relationships? He married twice, divorced both times, no surviving children. He was romantically linked with many high-profile women: Kim Basinger, Madonna, Carmen Electra. Did he ever talk about a particular woman that was the one that got away?
I'm not aware of that. I mean, it's an interesting thing in terms of the people that I interviewed, because Susannah Melvoin, who we've touched on several times, I believe I'm right in saying was actually they were engaged in the 80s for a while. So maybe it's her. It's widely felt. She never actually said it to me in quite as many words, but that Nothing Compares to You is about her. She was certainly close, very close to him, and including on the creation of some of his truly classic records, the Sign of the Times album in particular. So I suppose she probably would be the one I would nominate for that. Yeah, it's sad. I mean, I was just reading today actually about his siblings as well. And I think three of them there's only one full sibling, I believe, and the others, I think, some of them are in the process now of selling their part of his estate, I think. But again, it's inevitable, isn't it? In any kind of huge career and with massive success, those kind of negotiations, shall we say, are going to go on forever.
You mentioned Sign of the Times, and that was when he passed away. Minneapolis Star-Tribune called that his best, a masterpiece, perfect balance of everything Prince, funk, pop, rock, ballads.
Yeah.
So with that, I want to leave you with this last question. What is, in your opinion, his best album and his best song?
Well, I have to say, I probably would agree with that ruling about Sign of the Times, because I just think that it arrived at the perfect moment in his career, and it is, by that time, he's just taking in things from so many different, sources and influences. And it's a vast piece of work, of course, but I would always choose that over something like, say, Purple Rain. It's just personal choice, really. But I find that Sign of the Times is there's far more depth to it, far more variety to it. So that would probably get my vote. In terms of a song, almost impossible. There is one that I go back to and think about a lot, which I featured actually on a documentary that I made about Prince for the BBC, which is in its own way sort of the origin of this book. And it was a 2-hour documentary that I made on him called Prince and Me. And I finished it with a track from the Parade album, which was the soundtrack to Under the Cherry Moon. Last track on that album is a song called Sometimes It Snows in April. Not one of his biggest hits, but it's an incredibly poignant song, and all the more so when you remember that he died in April. I've actually got a little bit of the lyric here. So yeah, sometimes it snows in April. Sometimes I feel so bad, so bad. Sometimes I wish that life was never ending, and all good things, they say, never last. And I don't know, it just hits me, that one, because it sort of seems prescient.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the obvious Purple Rain album, Purple Rain song as my favorites, but I want to put one out there to you. One of, I think, his forgotten favorites, at least forgotten by many, Seven.
Yeah.
Song 7.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I was in college, we played that in the college radio station, and I absolutely loved that. We had the 45. We used to play.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I was fascinated with the number 7, and then you find out that the single goes to number 7.
Right.
Billboard. I wonder, what was it about the number 7?
I don't know. I mean, it's a bit like the kind of all of the symbolism that he used so much. I couldn't tell you, but it's just you're right, though. I mean, there's any number. I just think, in a career of hundreds of songs, there are any number of ones that got away, or they're not even ones that got away. There's songs that were hits. I mean, that you can't play them all. Alphabet Street, I think, fantastic.
Raspberry Beret, Pop Life.
Sure. Yeah.
Ones that they were hits, kind of forgotten now, but
right. Yeah, no, there's so many, but
did you hear Bruce Springsteen's version of Purple Rain after he passed, right? And another one was Chris Cornell, the late great Chris Cornell of Soundgarden, did that cover of Nothing Compares to You. Beautiful.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting. We touched on that rock thing earlier on, and a lot of the versions of the covers of Prince songs are by rock artists. Or even, I remember talking to Darius Rucker from, obviously a huge solo country star, but as we know him from Hootie and the Blowfish, absolutely obsessed with Prince. Saw him play Purple Rain at a country festival in the UK. So it just goes far and wide.
And Springsteen, I think the piece of trivia there is Purple Rain knocked Born in the USA off of number 1. Or
oh yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah,
well remembered.
Or no, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's Dancing in the Dark was Springsteen never had a number 1 single. Blinded by the Light was number 1 when Manfred Mann did it. It was a Bruce song, but Bruce had number 2 single with Dancing in the Dark, and I believe it was Purple Rain that kept it off the top.
Yeah, that's right, because it was Purple Rain was just ruled for months, didn't it? I mean, the album and
oh man, the 80s, what a great decade.
I know, yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Just the idea that those songs were competing, and were simultaneous.
What a time. What a time. Prince, A Portrait of the Artist in Memories and Memorabilia. And it's available September 7th through Welbeck Publishing. And we'll put a link in the show notes page to pick up a copy through Amazon. But also, check your local bookstore. Pick up a copy there, support the author and your local bookstore. A link to find the bookstore nearest you, also in the show notes page. And any social media pages you want to put out there? People want to get a hold of you?
Sure. I should mention the Twitter page, which is at psexton3, the numeral 3. And on Instagram, it's at Paul Sexton Writes, in one word, obviously.
All right, Paul, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to Paul Sexton for taking us through his book, Prince, A Portrait of the Artist in Memories and Memorabilia. Be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find us online at bookedonrock.com. On Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast. On Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address, thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. If you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Look forward to having you back again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.